Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was assigned to Team 8. What if Naruto had been selected for a different team? What if he'd had a different mentor? Who would guess the consequences would be so large? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 8, Revelations. Naruto did not sleep well that night. Of course, that was like saying that Uchiha Sasuke was a little stuck up, or that Sakura was slightly enamored of him. In other words, a massive understatement. He tossed and turned until dawn, sleeping fitfully for only a few minutes at a time. Each time he managed to drop off, he'd have such disturbing dreams that he'd thrash himself awake in short order, barely avoiding hitting Shino as he slept next to him. He pondered the new ninja's way he and Hinata were going to follow as he first dozed off, but then he abruptly found himself reliving that fight again. He was strangling the fire ninja. What was his name? Kuro? He could still feel the man's throat under his fingers, but it was the terror that shone in his eyes that Naruto couldn't forget. The man had been afraid of him, and worse, he'd enjoyed that fear. He'd lapped it up like his landlord's cat with a saucer of milk. He'd been disappointed when the fire grew too close to Hinata and he had to break the man's neck to stop his fire jutsu. Naruto knew that a shinobi would sometimes be required to kill an enemy in order to complete his assignment. They even talked about it at the academy, and an old man from the hospital came and talked to each student privately after that lecture. Naruto grimaced. When he'd met with the man, Aji-san said before dismissing him was that he doubted Naruto would have any problems. At the time, he'd thought he'd been praised and left with a smile on his face. Now, Naruto knew the man was making an oblique reference to the Kyuubi. After all, demons enjoyed killing, didn't they? So in the depths of the night, Naruto stared up at the darkness inside the tent he shared with Shino and wondered if the villagers had been right all along. Only a monster would savor someone's fear like that. He already had the demon's red chakra running through his body. Was it corrupting his mind as well? For a moment, he cursed Kurenai for teaching him to think things through, because now he could only lay there as his mind and emotions churned. It was said that power corrupts. How much more would that be true for power that flowed from a corrupted source? Inside him was the demon that wrecked Konoha and stole the life of its greatest leader. If it was corrupting him, shouldn't he try to do the honorable thing while he was still capable of feeling loyalty to Konoha? At one point, he began to think about reaching for a kunai, but then he remembered the mission they were on. Shino was still injured, and most of their group tactics depended on Naruto, as backup if nothing else. Also, if the Iwanins were afraid of him, they wouldn't press Team 8 for the last few days of their patrol. They needed him alive, at least until they made it back to Konoha. Then he could figure out what he needed to do. If something happened to him after they returned, the Hokage wouldn't send them on another dangerous mission until a replacement had been assigned. Maybe someone who wasn't stupid. Naruto slipped the metal ring off of his finger a couple of minutes before his alarm was due to shock him awake. He wearily climbed out of the small tent, gritty eyes blinking at the gray light of dawn. He shrugged into his jacket, trying to ignore the small flecks of dark brown amidst the green of his sleeve. He'd need to take a trip to the laundromat when they returned, or would he? Naruto shook his head. He'd been up all night thinking, but he still didn't know what to do. He gathered more wood for the fire, moving as silently as a wraith through the early morning stillness. When he returned to the camp, Kurenai-sensei was awake, sitting near the fire with a folded map in her lap. Her red eyes were expressionless as she studied him. "How did you sleep?" she asked, the concern in her voice evident, even to him. Naruto shrugged, not trusting his voice. Hinata was a little sore when she awoke. For all that, she'd slept soundly. It was hard to believe that yesterday hadn't just been some elaborate fever dream. She still couldn't recall what she'd been doing or thinking when she rescued Hanabi, but Naruto-kun said she'd been incredible. The way he'd smiled when he said that made her stomach ache a little, mainly because she knew she was making more out of it than was really there. Still, he wanted her to join him in his nindu. That had to count for something, didn't it? Maybe one day, when he became Hokage, she'd be able to teach others his ninja way. It was doubtful that she'd ever qualify for Umbu, but maybe she could become one of the Chiryunins that guarded his office. That way she'd be able to see him almost every day. Surely he'd still have a smile for his old teammate, even after he became Hokage? She smiled at this pleasant fantasy as she sat up and stretched. She had a few bruises and some stiffness, but she should be more than able to perform her duties within the team. She carefully pulled on her sandals and slipped out of the tent. Kurenai-sensei was already awake, but Shino-kun was just emerging from the other tent. She offered to look at his arm, but he merely shook his head. The pain is manageable, and it retains the necessary mobility. I am fine for now. Hinata nodded, and then began pouring out some rice for a quick breakfast before their next patrol. She frowned as she set the pot on the embers. Ano, Kurenai-sensei, she said in a quiet voice, is Naruto still asleep? No, Hinata, he's been up for a while now, Kurenai said, frowning slightly. I heard him several times in the night, so I don't think he slept very much at all. Is it because he ate too much? Hinata asked, feeling slightly guilty. She had a feeling he'd eaten more than he really wanted so she wouldn't feel awkward about dinner. It wasn't fair if he suffered because her father was displeased with her performance in the battle. She was growing weary of her constant failures, especially when others paid the price. No, Kurenai said, shaking her head. Then she sighed. He is troubled by yesterday's battle. Why is that? Shino asked, startling Hinata a little. He was so quiet at times that one almost forgot he was there. He performed the best out of the three of us, he continued. Kurenai took a deep breath, something Hinata had learned usually meant she was about to discuss something she didn't really wish to. Naruto was forced to take a life yesterday, and I believe it was his first time. Naruto killed one of the kidnappers. Hinata gasped. Actually, he dispatched Kuro and Kazuya both, Kurenai gently corrected her. The camp was cloaked in utter silence for a long moment. That is impressive, Shino finally said. Yes, Kurenai agreed, but I think he still needs to come to terms with that. We should leave him alone while he works this out. You remember when this issue was discussed at the academy? Both genin nodded. Good, Kurenai continued, then you know it will likely take a little while for Naruto to work through this. But he knows that he did what was necessary to preserve lives and ensure the successful completion of our mission. I don't think he will forget that, but if he is quiet for a while, we shouldn't make a big deal out of it, alright. Hinata nodded along with Shino, though her stomach churned at the thought of Naruto in turmoil. Sensei was right, they just needed to leave him alone until he could work things out and recover his focus. The old man had told her that the first time was usually the hardest by far. It wasn't good to become callous toward killing, like many did, but one grew better at regaining focus afterward. Naruto worked so hard at everything he did that she had little doubt he would bounce back from this and be his normal self in no time. Unfortunately, Naruto did not return to his normally cheerful self that day. He was unusually taciturn as they ran their patrol route, responding to his teammates with little more than a grunt. Under other circumstances, Hinata might have been crushed, thinking she had angered him in some way, but he was so obviously distraught that, for once, such thoughts didn't even occur to her. After they returned to camp, Kurenai mentioned that they should probably hunt so they will have some meat for dinner. Naruto curtly said that he would see to it. He left their camp so quickly that Hinata wondered if he really just wanted an excuse to be alone. Naruto returned half an hour later, carrying an entire deer across his shoulders. He dumped it next to the fire without a word and stalked off. Hinata stared at the bloody offering. Kurenai gripped the kunai that was embedded in the animal's skull, but she could only pull it out with obvious effort. The scrape of steel on bone was very loud in the otherwise silent camp. Hinata was annoyed to discover that she was pressing her index fingers together again. I will help you dress the meat, sensei, Shino said quietly, but Hinata looked up to realize that he was facing her, rather than Kurenai. As the two of them dragged the deer away from the camp to attend to this task, Hinata looked down at the gathered herbs she'd been organizing for dinner. Hyuga Hinata knew that she had many faults. She lacked confidence and the forcefulness her father said was essential for a strong leader. She was an inferior shinobi that inevitably dragged down the performance of her team, and she was indeed fortunate that they did not despise her for it. But she was not incapable of taking a hint. She followed the path Naruto had taken from the camp. While she had been trained to follow people by noticing traces of disturbed vegetation or trampled grass, this was hardly necessary. All she had to do was follow the splashing sounds. She found Naruto squatted by the small stream, scrubbing vigorously at his hands, which were already reddened from the rough treatment. He was muttering something under his breath that she couldn't quite make out, something about, over and done with. For an unhappy moment she wondered if he resented her and Shino for not doing more during the battle. Perhaps if they had, he wouldn't have been forced to kill. Her steps faltered and she almost turned around. But then she remembered that Naruto was seldom quiet when he didn't think something was fair. When they trained together, he wasn't cruel, but he also didn't mince words the few times he didn't think she was doing her best. He said he'd learned that from Guy-sensei, but after seeing the Jonin's dynamic entry technique, she wondered what else Naruto had learned. At least her confidence in Naruto kept her moving forward toward the stream bank. As she approached, the blonde Genin's head swung around so fast that Hinata flinched back in spite of herself. Naruto's scowl vanished in an instant as he looked chagrined. "Sorry," he muttered. Hinata tried not to think too hard about what she was doing. "No, Naruto, you don't seem yourself today," she finally said. Hinata didn't understand how what she said could have struck a nerve, but Naruto's face immediately shut down. "Maybe because I'm not," he snapped. Hinata was glad that her feet seemed frozen in place at his obvious signs of temper. That made it easier for her to stand her ground. At the academy, the doctor who came in, he told me that the first time is usually the hardest," she said, looking downward. "Really?" Naruto asked in a darkly sarcastic tone she'd never heard him use before. "Well, he told me he didn't think I'd have any problems at all, like I'm some monster that would probably enjoy killing," he added bitterly. Hinata felt her stomach contract into a ball of ice, as much for his tone as for the words themselves. Why had the old man told Naruto such a cruel thing? The rage she'd felt burning in her heart when she faced the spy was back, blazing even hotter than before. "Did he really say that?" she asked in a quiet voice, her hands shaking as she clenched her fists at her sides. Naruto nodded wearily, his expression puzzled. "That's bullshit," she yelled at Naruto, using a word she'd picked up from him in their training sessions. Naruto flinched back like he'd been kicked, lost his balance, and fell into the stream. Hinata's hands flashed to her traitorous mouth as her eyes widened in horror. How could she have done such a thing? Splashing and sputtering, Naruto struggled to his feet, water streaming out of his uniform. Hinata felt her heart breaking as she realized what she'd done. He'd never forgive her for this. He might even ask to be transferred to another team. He'd definitely never train with her again. Hinata began trying to formulate an apology of sufficient magnitude to salvage her friendship with her teammate as he wiped at his face, spat out some muddy water, and snorted. And then he laughed. It was more of a rusty chuckle at first, but it grew smoother and louder until he was halfway bent over, holding his knees for balance and whooping like a madman at the tops of his lungs. Hinata was still frozen in place as Naruto sloshed back up onto the bank. He took off his jacket and began trying to wring it out. "And I just got this thing dry too," he muttered. That statement seemed to snap Hinata's shocked awareness back into her body again. I am sorry, Naruto, I didn't." She tried to apologize. He waved off her apologies. "It was my own fault," he said. Then he cleared his throat and did a rough imitation of Iruka-sensei's voice. "But I am just shocked I tell you, at such coarse language." Hinata felt her face reddening. I didn't mean to, I was just." Her voice trailed off and she took a steadying breath. She raised her chin and looked Naruto squarely in the face. "He had no business saying something like that to you, Naruto-kun. That is what I meant to say." Naruto looked up from plucking the soaked t-shirt away from his chest. "Maybe you were more accurate the first time," he said with a sigh. Then he peeled off the sopping wet fabric. Hinata abruptly turned and looked away. She listened to more water droplets hit the grass behind her as he slowly wrung out his shirt. He wasn't doing anything provocative, but she was still intensely uncomfortable. This made her feel faintly ridiculous, as they'd been camping along the border for weeks now. Trying to distract herself, she thought about his ominous words as she arrived. What did you mean about not being yourself? She asked him without thinking. Naruto did not answer at first. Worried about having given offense again, Hinata turned back around. Naruto was lost in thought, the t-shirt dangling from his fingers. He looked up at her after a moment, and then pulled it back on. When he met her eyes again, Hinata was stunned to see something she hadn't expected to see. Fear. Her teammate, who killed 2 missing nins to protect them the day before, was showing more fear than she'd ever seen in him before. Was it possible that the old man had been right, and that Naruto was somehow destined to become some kind of mentally unbalanced killer? Something about that just didn't ring true though. This had to be bigger, much bigger to scare the future Hokage of Konoha. Somehow, thinking about things bigger than Hokages let something begin to fall into place in her mind. Does this have something to do with the red chakra? She suddenly asked. Naruto slumped to the ground like his legs could no longer bear his weight. He sprawled next to his damp jacket. Yes, he whispered. Hinata felt uncomfortably like an inquisitor, standing over him like that, so she gracefully knelt on the grass next to him. I noticed the seal on your stomach, the first time you used your chakra pulse technique, she said slowly. At first I thought it was some training method you used to build up your chakra. But I consulted all the scrolls I could find on seals, and the only things I could find that used seals that complex were prisons, Naruto said quietly, cutting her off. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression indecipherable. Hinata was almost afraid to breathe, wary of breaking this fey mood he'd fallen into. This was important, she knew it the same way she knew Naruto would find a way to become Hokage someday. But why was she almost shivering with fear? They never celebrate my birthday, he said slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. Why? She asked in little more than a whisper, even as her heart wrenched with pity and that cold voice in the back of her mind told her that she didn't really want to know the answer to that question. Better to let things go on as they were. Naruto sighed. I was born on October 10th, 12 years ago, he said. Hinata had always been the fact-checker for their group planning sessions, but everyone in Konoha knew what day that was. That's the day the Kyuubi. Her voice trailed off as her eyes went wide. Naruto looked down, but not before Hinata saw the light go right out of those bright blue orbs. The 4th Hokage couldn't kill it. No one could. So he sealed it into a newborn infant. You, Hinata whispered. It was an effort to even move her lips, as the enormity of what she'd just had confirmed crashed down on her. Yes, he said in a dead voice. The 3rd Hokage made a law forbidding anyone from revealing that secret except me, so you can't say anything. But our mission will be over in a few days. After that, you guys can get a new combat specialist. Why? She choked out. Was he angry that she'd figured out his secret? Or had she pressed him too hard for answers? She clenched her jaw to keep from crying out in dismay. Naruto shook his head like she was an annoying fly. Why? He asked in a puzzled voice. Hinata, there's a demon inside of me. It almost got out when I was fighting those guys, I could have killed all of you. Did you try to let it out? Hinata asked, trying to suppress her revulsion at what had been done to him. To be honest, there was some fear as well. Her clan had suffered heavy losses when the Kyuubi attacked, losses they had yet to recover. No. Naruto said quickly. But, when I got the drop on Kuro. He swallowed thickly, strangling him, and he was terrified of me and all this red chakra that was pouring out of me. And I was enjoying his fear. He was blasting out all this fire, but it couldn't stop me. I kept squeezing until I saw the fire was about to reach you, then I broke his neck to stop it. His voice trailed off and he raised his haunted eyes to hers. Hyuga Hinata had watched Uzumaki Naruto for years before they were placed on the same team. She thought she'd seen all his moods, happy, angry, frustrated, mischievous, but nothing like this. He looked sad and old, in a way. He seemed so lost and alone that she realized that much of what she'd admired before this day had been merely a mask. In a sense, she felt betrayed that her idol of confidence and determination had been revealed to have feet of clay. At the same time, her heart ached as she wondered how many people, if any, had ever seen this side of him. Naruto, she said gently. I don't think a demon would care if I were burned or not. But that just means that our personalities may be mixing, Naruto insisted. I care about what happens to you now, but what about next mission? Will I stop caring then and let you die? Hinata just shook her head violently, making her bangs rearrange themselves. Not you, she insisted, never. You don't understand, Naruto insisted. I was scaring him and I was enjoying it like some sick freak. Ano, Hinata murmured as she tried to get her emotions back under control. What she'd learned was huge, but she'd have to digest that later. Naruto needed her to become irrational right now. Kuro is the one who burned you. Naruto nodded, but didn't say any more. Did he do other things to anger you, besides hurt you and Shino? Hinata asked shrewdly. Naruto's face reddened, but he just nodded and did not otherwise answer. Naruto, the old man told me that such feelings are normal in a violent confrontation, Hinata continued in a voice that was almost serene compared to earlier. Naruto blinked. Really? Hinata nodded. So you don't think? Naruto began, but let his voice trail off as Hinata shook her head. Are you okay with this, Hinata? She looked up at the almost pleading tone in his voice. Whether it was that or the haunted look in his eyes, something gave her the courage to lean forward and put her hand on his forearm. The skin was cool and damp from his recent dunking, but it warmed rapidly under her fingertips. I would rather have you stay with teammate, and Naruto-kun, she managed to choke out before her throat completely closed off. Naruto gazed at her with something akin to wonder in his eyes, and it thrilled her to the core that she had made that dead look go away. She had made Naruto happy again, with just a few words. She was more proud of that than any of the pitiful few triumphs of her life thus far. Thank you, Hinata-chan, Naruto said, smiling as she reddened even further. His stomach made a hollow grinding sound, so long and so prolonged that it utterly shattered the mood. Naruto ducked his head sheepishly as Hinata quickly withdrew her hand from his arm. Her hand covered her mouth, concealing a shy smile. I should be getting dinner started, she said as she gracefully rose to her feet. Naruto grabbed his jacket as he rolled to his feet. He carried the damp fabric as he followed Hinata back to the camp. We have sufficient meat to last for the remaining duration of our assignment, Shino reported as Hinata rejoined them around the smokeless fire. He was carefully unwinding the bandages on his forearm. Hinata nodded and began preparing skewers as Naruto ducked into the boys' tent. Sensei, she said quietly and Kurenai looked up from the kunai she was sharpening. Yes Hinata? Kurenai asked. I think you should talk to Naruto, she answered calmly, though she was still seething inside. The counselor who spoke to him at the academy gave him extremely poor advice. Why would he do that? Kurenai asked, peering intently at her. Ano. Hinata said, her eyes flickering over at Shino for an instant. I am not permitted to say, she replied. Does this have to do with the Kyuubi? Shino asked in a perfectly normal tone of voice. Hinata froze in place. Naruto's head shot out of the tent at the word Kyuubi. He frowned at Hinata, who began stammering denials of having broken the law as he crawled out of the tent in a pair of shorts and a dry t-shirt. I am not stupid, Naruto, Shino said evenly, turning toward the boy and beginning to tick off points on his fingers. You have a chakra capacity exceeding that of most jonin, even thought you have just become a genin. You can master highly chakra-intensive techniques with far more ease than you can master less demanding ones, suggesting that your chakra capacity is literally filled to overflowing most of the time. Even the most forthcoming adults of Konoha are strangely unwilling to discuss the reasons why you are shunned by most. There are no physical relics from the nine-tailed fox, even though our history texts state that it was slain by the fourth Hokage. Your physical stamina is superhuman and you recover from minor injuries at a rate unprecedented for someone not under a physician's care. Your birth date is a matter of public record, as are the unusual birthmarks on your face. And finally, when we spar, I can have half my colony feed off of your chakra until they are replete and you do not even notice. He closed his hands and seemed to look Naruto squarely in the eyes. I am neither stupid nor unobservant. Hinata's mouth was hanging open, though she was relieved that Naruto knew she hadn't revealed his secret. Their sensei looked both proud and amused. The last member of their team was neither. You stuck your bugs on me when we sparred. Naruto demanded, outraged. That's cheating. I was curious as to whether your increased speed was from chakra or purely physical conditioning, Shino replied. Naruto made a face. I am so smashing them if you do that again, he threatened. It would be useless to do so, Shino replied, since you seem to have inexhaustible chakra reserves. It is also not good for the Kekai to gorge on chakra. You get fat bugs? Naruto asked, and then gave a shudder. Never mind, I don't want to know. How long have you? I have suspected for a while. Our last sparring session at the inn was the last data I needed. I finalized my conclusions and eliminated the alternative hypotheses after we established our camp here. The only possible explanation for the observed facts was that the Kyuubi had been sealed to you or merged in a similar fashion. The bug user looked down and began smearing a clear ointment on his burned wrist. Naruto came out of the tent to sit down by the fire. In his black t-shirt and dark orange shorts he looked younger, in a way. His weights were still visible on his arms and legs, but Hinata almost didn't even notice them anymore. He rubbed at his eyes and Hinata remembered Sensei saying he hadn't slept well the previous night. So Shino, do you have a problem with this? It being sealed inside me? He asked. The Hokage would not have placed you on a genin team if you were dangerous in any way, Shino responded. Our sensei is unusually solicitous of our physical safety, and she does not seem apprehensive regarding your presence. Your more unusual attributes, which I surmise are effects of the Kyuubi being sealed inside you, have proven to be an asset, both in training and during confrontations. Naruto nodded slowly at this, but Kurenai-sensei spoke up. You have spoken about the Hokage's motivations, as well as my own, Shino, she said. What are your personal observations? Shino glanced at their sensei with what Hinata might have considered annoyance, had it come from another. He paused briefly, and adjusted his glasses before speaking. Based upon my interactions, I find the reactions of the villagers to be illogical and poorly thought through. Naruto bears them far less ill will than many others would in his position, something that would be impossible if he were being influenced or possessed by a demonic entity. Also, his solicitude toward certain of his superiors and colleagues is at odds with such a negative characterization of his personality. Naruto just blinked at their teammate. Then he turned toward Kurenai-sensei. He's saying that you're too nice a person for him to worry about that, the Jonin said with a sigh. Oh, Naruto said. He turned back toward Shino. Why didn't you just say so? He asked. Shino did not answer, and instead began rewrapping his bandages. Hinata moved to help him, but he waved her off, proving to be surprisingly dexterous with his left hand. Hinata went back to preparing the skewers while they all sat in silence. Naruto propped up his jacket and pants to dry near the fire, flashing a grin at her embarrassment, then began feeding small twigs into the flames. Kurenai took out a kunai and began slowly filing a nick out of the blade. Hinata? Kurenai asked after a few minutes. Yes, sensei. Hinata answered as she packed fragrant herbs around the sliced fragments of meat. Another pot of rice simmered over the coals. Why did you say I needed to talk to Naruto? The Jonin asked as she tested the edge of the kunai she'd been sharpening. Hinata swallowed. She gave Naruto an apologetic glance. Sensei, I do not believe Naruto received the proper instruction at the academy. On the subject we discussed this morning. Kurenai-sensei's eyes widened as she seemed to understand what Hinata was hinting at. Hinata didn't want to repeat Naruto's painful words if she could help it. The idea of anyone saying that to someone training to be a shinobi was awful, but saying it to someone like Naruto-kun was just unforgivable. Sensei seemed to share her opinion because her eyes narrowed and the air suddenly felt much colder. The three genins froze in place as the killer intent swept over them. It was fortunate that all of them knew they were not the target of this rage. Naruto, come with me, Kurenai snapped. Naruto jumped to his feet and followed their sensei out of the clearing without a word. Hinata swallowed and resumed preparing dinner, hoping that the familiar task would soothe her taut nerves. Naruto was thoughtful as he and Kurenai returned to their camp, following the appetizing smells of Hinata's handiwork. He was a little embarrassed that he hadn't really considered that the old man might have sought to sabotage him as much as the instructors who hated him. The old man was an expert on human psychology, which was why he conducted the counseling sessions, and he'd known his own subject well enough to know how to conceal his distaste for the Kuwabi's jailer. That's what made his false advice and assessment so effective. But it didn't make Naruto feel any less stupid. Kurenai's anger had been awe-inspiring, not to mention a little frightening. When they'd withdrawn far enough from the camp for a private discussion, she made him sit on a fallen log and tell her everything that was said during the counseling session. Before he was even halfway done, she was up and pacing as he talked. When he was finished, she turned away from him for a moment. Her hands moved too quickly to see in a trio of kunai embedded in the trunk of the tree she was facing. That wasn't so unusual, but the fact that they'd penetrated halfway up the handles was. After retrieving her kunai and taking several deep breaths, Kurenai-sensei explained what he should have learned at the academy, before ever graduating, before even thinking about going on a mission. As a shinobi of the leaf, he would sometimes be placed into mortal conflicts, and inevitably would have to take a life. That was part of the job, and it didn't make him a monster to have done so. More important were the details. Was it possible for him to have avoided killing? Would avoidance have placed his teammates or his mission at risk? Or was he looking for excuses to kill? Was he antagonizing potential enemies in order to have an excuse to fight and kill them? In that context, yesterday's battle appeared quite different. The enemy had struck the first blows, attacking Iruka and kidnapping Kano Amaru and the bratty Hanabi. There was no question of letting them escape with their captives, even if Hinata hadn't already engaged them. With Hinata and Shino down, he and Kurenai were outnumbered. He just wished he hadn't been quite so gleeful with Kuro. Kurenai-sensei seemed to share Hinata's intuition. What did he say? She asked. When Naruto just stared at her, she continued, I was concentrating on a genjutsu, but I could hear that they were talking. I don't think you would have experienced such strong emotions in a combat situation without provocation. Guy and I both taught you better than that. Naruto was silent for a moment. The big one told Kuro to cook me so they could gang up on you. Kuro said he'd rather take his time with Yu and Hinata, he whispered as his nails dug into his palms. His hands still shook. Kurenai quickly leaned forward, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him. Naruto? What? Naruto asked, shaking his head to clear it of those memories. Try to calm down, she said. Your chakra was spiking very strongly, and I could see a faint red glow around you. As I said before, you seem to tap into its chakra when you are feeling strong negative emotions. I'm sorry, sensei, Naruto mumbled as he looked down. I was just dash. You were just acting in your role within the team, she finished for him. A role I set for you and a role you fulfilled beyond my expectations yesterday. But Shino and Hinata got hurt. Naruto protested. Kurenai frowned. I do not expect you to intercept every blow aimed at your teammates, Naruto. That would be an unrealistic, not to mention unfair, expectation to place upon you. I apologize if that was the impression I had given. Do you think Shino and Hinata are weak? No sensei. Naruto said quickly. He'd wanted to smack that brat Hanabi when she said that about Hinata. Good. They are shinobi of the leaf, the same as you. Do not insult them, she replied. They know the risks the same as you. While your abilities seem to be better suited for a direct confrontation, they are not helpless. But... Naruto choked out as he struggled with his emotions. They're my friends, he said in little more than a whisper. He looked up as he felt a hand on his shoulder. Kurenai was sitting on the log again, smiling at him. Was that so hard to admit, Naruto? You care about your friends. That doesn't sound like the behavior of a demon, or a hardened killer, does it? Naruto slowly shook his head. I don't want anyone on Team 8 getting hurt, he said. Kurenai gave his shoulder a squeeze, startling him as she removed her hand. I know how you feel, she said quietly. I felt the same way about my team when I was a genin. Killing an enemy is never something to be taken lightly, but when it is done in defense of another life, no one will fault you, Naruto. But I was enjoying. Naruto protested. Their threats made you angry, didn't they? His sensei asked. Naruto took a deep breath and nodded. He didn't even want to think about that again. That person also taunted you as we fought, Kurenai added. While you did not allow him to goad you into making a mistake, it is understandable that you might feel a sense of vindication when you were finally able to come to grips with him. Does that make sense to you? I suppose. Naruto said in a dubious voice. Kurenai sighed. Given that you seem to tap into the red chakra easier when you are feeling strong emotions, there is a possibility that your prisoner will attempt to influence you at such moments. However, your behavior during that skirmish was well within the bounds of acceptable behavior for an active duty shinobi. Stay on your guard the next time this happens, and I am sure you will continue to make me proud to have you as a student. Naruto felt like he'd been clubbed. Proud? He stammered. Kurenai just stared at him incredulously. Naruto, you defended your team and defeated 2 enemies of higher rank. I am not sure I would have been able to defeat all 3 at once, so you quite possibly saved several lives yesterday. Do not let your concerns blind you to the fact that you performed your role well above my expectations. Naruto felt like an idiot, sitting there with his mouth hanging open. But he was completely numb. An hour ago, he'd been thinking about, well, never mind. Now, his sensei was telling him that what he'd done yesterday made her proud of him, and that he had done nothing he needed to worry about. It was almost too much for him to deal with. Kurenai sniffed the air. I think Hinata has dinner almost ready. We'd better get back or we'll hurt her feelings, right Naruto? He nodded dumbly and stood up to follow his sensei back to the camp. His mind was still trying to catch up, but he knew it would. Eventually. Shino carefully flexed his right hand, feeling the dull ache as the skin pulled taut under the bandages. The medicinal cream Hinata loaned him was surprisingly effective at dulling the pain. When he asked her where she had purchased it, she shyly admitted that she'd made it herself. He wondered how she had become so adept at medicinal preparations, but he wasn't sure he really wanted to know. While Naruto wasn't the most perceptive of shinobi, he had been able to sense that something was not right with Hinata and the other Hyugas. It was hardly his place to pry into the workings of another Konoha family, let alone a clan with the influence and secretive nature of the Hyugas. However, once Naruto had raised his suspicions, it was almost impossible for him to not pick up on any clues that presented themselves. He wondered if his teammate had done that on purpose, but that seemed unlikely. Naruto was hardly manipulative, he lacked both the awareness and the inclination to make use of others in such a way. He was, for example, still ignorant of Hinata's feelings for him, which was an impressive feat in and of itself. He might have compared the Hyuga girl's affection for Naruto to the behavior of Uchiha Sasuke's fan club, but for several key differences. Hinata's behavior was far less forward than that of the Kunoichis who pursued the last Uchiha of Konoha. She funneled her energies into improving her abilities by training with the object of her affections, a far more useful activity than pointless histrionics and bickering with rivals. Not that Hinata had too many rivals, of course. And that brought him to the last major difference. Given what he had seen of Uchiha Sasuke's behavior, he seemed less than interested in any of the Kunoichis chasing him. As an object of romantic attentions, he was far too self-absorbed and taciturn to make an ideal partner. Rather, they seemed to be chasing an impossibly idealized mirage they had built up in their minds and dubbed Uchiha Sasuke. They pursued the boy because they didn't really know anything about him. Hinata, on the other hand, seemed to understand Naruto better than anyone else, and it was only after being on the same team with them for months that Shino was starting to realize that. Abarame Shino had always prided himself regarding his observational skills. He liked to think that he saw things as they were, rather than letting emotions or prejudgments cloud his vision, so this was a particularly galling conclusion to reach. Nonetheless, correct behavior required that he admit his error. Hinata, he said quietly, watching her turn the fragrant skewers over the coals. Yes, Shino. She said, looking up. Do you recall our conversation at lunch the day we were assigned to Kurenai-sensei? Hinata didn't answer, but merely nodded, her eyes curious. Upon further consideration, I am forced to conclude that you were accurate in your initial assessment of Uzumaki Naruto, and I was incorrect, Shino said, trying to maintain his normal, precise diction. Hinata frowned at him, which was somewhat unexpected. Are you saying that because of what you had confirmed today? She replied, her voice somewhat sharp, which was even more surprising. Shino paused to gather his thoughts before formulating a response. Hinata's friendship with Naruto was having an even stronger effect on her personality than he expected. It would remain to be seen if this would be fortuitous or not. Not directly. However, I am beginning to realize the degree to which his learning environment was compromised by the rancor of the adults at the Konoha Ninja Academy. It was the subtle discouragement and negative feedback he received from the instructors that retarded his development, not a lack of focus or an unwillingness to apply himself. Observing his progress after he began working with jonins like Kurenai-sensei and Might Guy has given me a much more accurate conception of his work ethic and overall capabilities. This has, in turn, drawn me to new conclusions. Hinata's pupil-less eyes seemed to look right through him, even without the Byakugan active. Shino found himself somewhat uncomfortable under that gaze, which was another first. While he'd hoped Hinata would be able to coax Naruto out of his funk, he had no idea what passed between them while he and Kurenai dressed out the deer. Whatever transpired, it seemed to have had a significant effect on both of them. Naruto had revealed his secret to someone, probably for the first time, and it seemed to have galvanized the normally shy Kunoichi. What are your conclusions? Hinata asked, snapping Shino's mind back to the present. I think you may be correct regarding his potential. With help, he may well become Hokage someday, Shino said. Hinata's eyes widened slightly, and then she nodded. With our help, she added. Shino computed the probabilities of him recovering consciousness yesterday before one of the kidnappers killed him. Without Naruto's presence, they were marginal at best. With our help, he agreed. Thank you, Shino-kun, Hinata said, smiling. Shino straightened his glasses. Konoha will prosper with a strong Hokage, he said. Naruto felt almost giddy with relief as he sat down next to the fire. Shino and Hinata looked up as he and Kurenai returned, but Hinata just smiled and returned to her cooking while Shino did whatever he did behind that collar of his. I'm sorry I was acting like a jerk earlier, he said. Shino made a small noise that almost sounded like a snort. Ano, Naruto, Hinata said as she carefully laid the hot skewers on the plates, we understand now. He smiled and scratched at the back of his head. It was a little uncomfortable, being around them after the conversations he'd had with Shino and Hinata. It was strange, he'd been dreading revealing his secret for so long, but once it was done, and nothing bad had happened, he still felt oddly exposed. He slowly began to relax as they ate. Hinata had outdone herself again. He didn't know how she'd managed to gather so many fresh greens to go with the rice and meat, but they added a nice touch. It wasn't ramen, but it was really good. Maybe she used her Byakugan while they were patrolling. As they ate, Kurenai discussed their plans for the remaining 3 days of their assignment. They would need to keep an eye out for their relief, but any shinobi without a properly sealed scroll should be treated as potentially hostile. It was not unknown for an infiltration team to take advantage of the changing of the border guards. When they finished, Naruto jumped up to collect the plates. When he bent over to get Hinata's, he gave her a big smile. That was really good, Hinata-chan. While she blushed, for once Hinata didn't look away when he said something nice to her. Thank you, Naruto, she replied in a small voice. He gave Kurenai-sensei a big grin when he grabbed her utensils, which she returned with a raised eyebrow. Shino's plate still had a little rice left on it. You sure you ate enough for all those extra bugs? Naruto asked him in a worried voice. I don't want them chewing on me in the night if they get hungry. Shino made an exasperated sound. My allies receive more than adequate nourishment, Naruto. Furthermore, they are incapable of attacking humans in the absence of specific instructions from their host. The Abarame family has spent years breeding their Kikai bugs for absolute obedience, and there have been no fratricidal incidents since they were introduced. Shino's voice trailed off as Naruto's laughter could no longer be contained. Shino silently handed him his plate as Naruto got himself back under control again. Idiot, he said as Naruto turned to walk away. Naruto's laughter carried all the way back to the camp as he carried the dishes down to the stream. The following day's patrol was fairly routine. The rock ninjas seemed just as reluctant to test their vigilance again, a fact that never failed to bring a smile to Naruto's lips. He wondered how badly they would freak out once he became Hokage. Thinking about why they feared the fourth Hokage wiped the smile from his face. As he leapt from tree to tree, he remembered his shock at thinking the fourth Hokage had killed people. Kurenai said that things seemed to have gotten more serious after one of his students was killed. Now he had at least some idea of what they'd been talking about. If he'd been willing to kill to protect his team, how would it be for the Hokage, who was supposed to protect the entire village? Would he be ready to do what was necessary to protect everyone? Would he even be able to live with himself if was forced to wage war to protect his people? Since the ambush, Naruto had fallen into the habit of keeping an eye on Hinata as they traveled through the trees. It only made sense, given that she was usually the first to sense danger with her eyes. But watching the Hyuga girl leap from branch to branch also supplied him with his answer. He remembered how relieved he'd been when he realized that Shino and Hinata were all right. Yes, he could do what was necessary to keep his precious people safe. As they were looping back toward camp, Hinata stopped suddenly. Naruto's hands were already forming seals as her head snapped to the side. She held one hand behind her back, with 3 fingers extended. Shino dropped silently to the ground and Naruto knew his bugs were already in motion. Hinata and Kurenai changed directions and leapt into a tree to the left of their original course. Naruto followed them, accelerating so he was able to land next to them when they touched down to confront the trio of interlopers. They wore the masks and hooded robes that just shouted Umbu to any resident of Konoha, but Naruto didn't relax at all. Kurenai said they needed to beware imposters, and she and Hinata would be right in the middle if a potential battle broke out. "Can we help you?" Kurenai asked coolly. Naruto noticed a couple of Kikai bugs pass by his feet, heading toward the intruders. "We're your relief," the middle Umbu said in a bored tone, his voice slightly muffled by the boar mask. "You're early," she observed. "Hokage's orders," the Umbu replied laconically. "Do you have proof?" Kurenai asked. The boar-masked Umbu slowly pulled out a scroll tube and tossed it to the Jonin. Naruto blurred into motion, snatching the scroll out of the air and pivoting so his body was between it and his team. "Hinata!" he barked. The Umbu dropped into defensive stances as Naruto braced himself for an explosion or attack. "It's all right," Hinata said quickly, her pale eyes glowing in the afternoon sunlight. "Just paper and ink. No chakra." Naruto relaxed slightly, and handed the scroll to Kurenai. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her closely examine the seal before breaking it and scanning the message. "Suspicious little bastard, aren't you?" the boar-masked Umbu asked in a conversational tone. "But you'd do well not to startle us. Someone could have gotten hurt." "It's authentic," Kurenai said after a moment. "And it's probably not a good idea to startle us, either." She nodded her head toward the 30 or so Narutos dropping out of the trees behind the Umbu. "We sensed them," the crow-masked Umbu spoke up. "It's a lot of bunshin, but they're hardly likely to distract us from you." Kurenai smiled sweetly as they turned to leave for their camp. "Not bunshin," she corrected. "Kaja bunshin." One of the clones, smirking, smashed his fist into a tree, splintering the bark. The Umbu twitched at the sudden sound. It only required a handful of minutes to break down the tents and pack up their equipment. Hinata left most of the meat and gathered greens for the Umbu to use, but Naruto made a special point of gathering the leftovers from Hinata's cooking. She blushed a little when he said that it was too good to leave for strangers. He was starting to get an idea of why she acted so weirdly when he complimented her, but he didn't like where his thoughts were taking him. So he left it alone for a while. Within the hour they were on the road back to Konoha. Naruto felt some of the tension flow out of his body as they left the borderlands. It would be good to return home, where hot showers and ramen could be found, the latter in large quantities. As he adjusted his heavy backpack, he glanced over at Hinata. She didn't seem to be as eager to return. Naruto thought about that a lot as their steps carried them home. Chapter 9, Returning to Konoha. Kurenai couldn't recall ever being quite so relieved to see the familiar skyline of Konoha again. The only time that even came close was when she returned alone that time, but she'd been too numbed by the death she had seen to feel much of anything. She was annoyed to find herself unconsciously smoothing her sleeve, but the fabric wasn't stiff with Matai's blood. Perhaps Sarutobi was correct about her living far too much in the past. She glanced back at her genin team, proud of the way they maintained their formation and remained alert. Only the occasional smile from one of them indicated that they weren't still in the border zone. Shino, of course, was as reserved and taciturn as usual, even disregarding how little of his face was visible. Hinata had been quiet since they'd received orders to return to Konoha, and her face seemed to settle into a mask as the gates appeared in the distance. No, it was Naruto who was different. The blonde genin had changed since the day he'd finally revealed the truth to his teammates. Kurenai wasn't normally one to become overly smug, but she'd been exactly right about the effects of him opening up to Shino and Hinata. A weight, present for as long as she'd known him, seemed to have lifted from his shoulders. She knew that her acceptance of him had made a difference, but the acceptance of his peers, especially given the implications of the Hokage's law, seemed even more crucial. Rather than rejecting or fearing him, as the Sandaime seemed to fear, Hinata and Shino had accepted the presence of the Kyuubi within Naruto in as positive a way as Kurenai could have hoped. Indeed, if what she'd pieced together was correct, Hinata had reacted in a rather violent way to the implication that Naruto was a monster. Nothing else could explain the distant shout that had carried up from the stream. Kurenai grew more concerned for her other students now. After her father's abominable behavior at their camp, she wasn't surprised that Hinata seemed to dread returning to Konoha. More surprising was the undercurrent of anger she seemed to sense in Shino. The boy was as quiet as ever, but his forehead, the only portion of his face fully visible, seemed to be furrowed with a frown more and more often. When she'd asked him if anything was the matter during a rest stop, he'd merely said that he was being forced to re-evaluate his assessments of a large number of parties. This was unusually opaque, even for an Abarame, but he seemed to be feeling an echo of her own anger regarding how Konoha dealt with certain issues. All the same, she needed to caution the boy to be circumspect. If her suspicions were true, there might be a deeper issue than simple bigotry, not something a genin should be directly involved in, no matter how talented he might be. She supposed she might be hopelessly paranoid, but she'd rather that than to repeat the mistakes of the past. Maybe Umino Iruka would be ready for a visitor after they reported to the Hokage. Abarame Shino let his body move automatically, his teammates and allies alert for danger, while his mind composed a list of people. At the top of the list, of course, were his parents, especially his father. While he appreciated the strictures the Hokage's law forced him to operate under, Shino did not appreciate the paucity of hard information that his clan had acquired before formulating their opinion of Uzumaki Naruto. He hadn't missed the concerned silence among many of his relatives when his team assignment had been announced. Even more galling was the realization that he'd allowed their unreasoning distaste for the prankster to color his own opinions while they were both students at the Konoha Ninja Academy. Shino did not know whether it was more annoying to realize he'd been wrong, or that he'd picked up their attitude without realizing it. Either way, it was past time for him to realign some people's attitudes to make them more congruent with the reality of the situation. In short, he was highly offended. That was the only word that really fit. His clan had compromised the integrity of his logic and his objectivity. And that was completely unacceptable. Not for the last time, Shino heard the low buzz as his new colony became agitated. He forced himself to let his aggravation abate. It would not do to upset his new allies. Hinata felt her stomach contract with dread as the gates of Konoha appeared in the distance. She loved her village, but in this situation, she dreaded what the sight of it symbolized. Their mission was coming to an end. The border patrol had been a dangerous, dirty, strenuous job. Her muscles still ached, with or without the weights, from the endless patrols they'd run. Despite bathing in the stream as often as possible, she still felt grimy, and her jacket was several shades of gray darker than when she left, due to the buildup of ground-in dirt. She'd been in dangerous situations more than once, and if it hadn't been for Naruto, she would likely have died trying to rescue Hanabi. Yet, it had also been one of the happiest times of her life. It was puzzling at first, the joy she'd taken in such a difficult mission. It wasn't until she thought back on her father's visit to teammates' campsite that it began to sink in. It was reasonable for him to join the pursuit of Hanabi's kidnappers, and to make sure every means was used to secure her freedom and guarantee the safety of the Hyuga bloodline. Nonetheless, it had felt wrong for him to be there. The campsite that they had spent so much time preparing, the camp that had witnessed so many meals and idle conversations with her team, it felt violated by her father's presence. When Hinata realized that she didn't want him to be there, she was initially scandalized by her blatant disrespect. He was her father, and more importantly the head of the clan. She should have felt honored by his presence, however fleeting. She tried to make him and the others feel welcome, preparing as good a meal as could be managed in such rustic surroundings, but she was too slow and that had been thwarted as well. Even now, her face burned at the thought of all the wasted food, the sign of a foolish host. She regretted it later, but she'd been gratified that Naruto and Shino ate so much, even as she realized that they were doing it solely to save her feelings. Just thinking about her teammates made her wish they were leaving for another patrol, rather than returning from one. She knew she'd sleep better in the small tent she shared with Kurenai-sensei than in her soft bed in the Hyuga compound. A place where no one wanted a failure like her. Naruto's heart sped up when he saw the gates of Konoha. Their mission was coming to an end. More importantly, everyone was returning under their own power. Shino's burned wrist was hardly more than an annoyance at this point, and the larger boy made a point of sparring with Naruto more than once on the way back. Shino was a little careful how he blocked with that arm, but when Naruto found himself unconsciously easing up on his teammate, the bug user blew him off his feet with a side thrust kick that drove the air from his lungs. Naruto shook his head at the memory of rolling to his feet, gasping, only to see Shino standing in a taijutsu stance, right arm extended and making a come here gesture with his fingers. After that he relaxed and went all out against his friend, and they were both thoroughly bruised within half an hour. Friend. That word again. He wondered if Kurenai-sensei ever got tired of being right all the time. It made a huge difference to know that Shino and Hinata knew about the Kyuubi, and just didn't care. Moreover, Shino figured it out on his own, and Hinata had guessed. His teammates would have to have been extremely dense or self-centered for him to be able to conceal his differences for much longer. But they knew, and more importantly, they accepted him. He didn't think he'd ever forget the shock when Hinata had just exploded like that. He never imagined that she could ever get angry like that, but watching her get absolutely furious on his behalf, that was an odd feeling. Unsettling, but nice. However, as they returned to Konoha, the kunoichi became increasingly quiet and withdrawn. Naruto wasn't the most perceptive shinobi in his class, but the change in her demeanor was more than obvious to him. It was puzzling, especially in its timing. They were leaving the danger zone now, and returning to a safe area, as safe as any village full of shinobi, that is. Naruto was looking forward to some civilized amenities involving heated water, ramen and showers, and he would have thought Hinata would as well. At least the showers anyway. Instead she looked increasingly uncomfortable as they approached the gates. He wondered about some things he'd learned during their mission. Hanabi was a brat, of that there was no question. Naruto had no siblings, but he'd heard Kiba complain about his older sister often enough to realize that brothers and sisters didn't always get along. On the other hand, her father should have been proud of the way Hinata had rescued her sister. Instead, he and that jerk cousin of hers looked at Hinata like it was her fault Hanabi had been kidnapped in the first place. Naruto didn't understand it. But he didn't have to understand it to know he didn't like it. Uzumaki Naruto rubbed at the back of his head as he thought it over. Thinking like this wasn't one of his strengths, but Kurenai-sensei had been pushing him more and more to see underneath the underneath. It was a really goofy phrase that meant trying to understand all the subtle undercurrents in a situation. It was a good skill for a shinobi to develop, because on a mission, unseen things could end your life. On the other hand, Naruto didn't think it was supposed to be applied to understanding kunoichis. But for all that, it wasn't too hard to put together. He remembered how tired and sore Hinata had been from that special Hyuga training, and how she seemed to revive once they were out in the woods. He remembered the long hours she volunteered to do extra training with him, and her embarrassed silence when he'd asked if her family wouldn't object to her working so late and missing dinner. Combining that with the cold way her father had treated her at the campsite led Naruto to only one inescapable conclusion. Hinata's family sucked worse than cold ramen. Naruto was about to congratulate himself on his perceptiveness when the natural follow-up question left him stumped. What could he possibly do about it? He didn't think beating the crap out of Hyuga Hayashi would help, even if he were capable of such a thing. Puzzling over this eroded any sense of triumph he'd gleaned from his realization. Furtive glances at his teammate seemed to confirm his guess, as her gaze seemed to sink lower and lower toward the ground as she approached the walls of Konoha. Naruto's mood sank as well. Even though he thought he knew the source of the problem, he couldn't think of anything he could do to help. He hated feeling helpless, especially when one of his friends was hurting, but how could he protect her from her family? He let out a sigh as they passed through the gates, causing Kurenai to glance back at him. Maybe Kurenai-sensei will know what to do, he mused. A little weight seemed to lift from his shoulders at the thought. He'd never seen her at a loss before. Well, maybe except for that one time with the Lee Spandex henge. In accord with standing orders, no sooner had Kurenai reported to the Chiryunin guarding the Hokage's door than they were ushered into his office. The old man was concerned, but he still smiled as Team 8 filed into the room and stood before him. They stood at attention, but he waved over one of the Chiryunins and folding chairs were brought for all of them. This may take a while, he explained. But before we begin your official debriefing, he began, setting down his pipe, I want to personally thank you for my grandson's safety. Kano Amaru still grumbles about having to be saved by his eternal rival. The old man paused, smiling as Naruto rolled his eyes, but I can tell from his eyes that it was a very close thing. I can't tell you how relieved I am, or how proud I am that you are all shinobi of the leaf. The three genin all looked down, clearly embarrassed from his praise. The Hokage cleared his throat and asked Kurenai to make her official report. He listened intently as she summarized the events of the last few weeks, but he did stop her at some points for clarification. They mistook Naruto for the Yondaime? He asked, both startled and alarmed at that revelation. That is correct, Hokage-sama, Kurenai confirmed. The Iwa shinobi grew quite alarmed at his presence, but they did not seek to test our vigilance again after that initial confrontation. Sarutobi rubbed at his chin as he pondered this. A quiet border is a blessing, but I will send a communique to our representative in Earth Country to explain their mistake. I would rather they did not feel that we were provoking them in such a fashion. Send them my grades from the academy, Aji-san, Naruto said with a grin. Let them know they were scared of the dead last in his class. The Sandaime was shocked by two things. The first was the fact that Naruto would make a joke about his poor grades in the academy, something that had previously been a sore point with him. He couldn't imagine him bringing that up, even for the opportunity to make someone else look foolish. The other was the reactions of his teammates. The little Hyuga girl turned toward Naruto, eyebrows drawing together and mouth half opened. She hesitated, and the Hokage imagined that his presence was the only thing preventing her from protesting Naruto's words. Even more surprising was the Abarame boy's reaction. He merely turned his head and glared at Naruto. Well, it was impossible to see his eyes, but his body language was unmistakable. Naruto's reaction supported the Hokage's assessment as well, for he immediately flushed and scratched the back of his head, smiling sheepishly. I was just kidding, he mumbled. Beside them, Kurenai kept her face immobile, but her eyes were dancing with a mixture of pride and vindication. Sarutobi gave her a small nod of agreement. He was gratified to witness that Naruto was less defensive, and that he had made such loyal friends of his teammates. Perhaps one day the boy would be able to share his secret with others of his generation. The light mood darkened as Kurenai began to describe the battle against the kidnappers. He was a little surprised to learn that the Hyuga Hinata initiated the engagement, but her sensei made a point of explaining the rushed nature of the interception and how she fully supported Hinata's reasoning. He also noticed Naruto nudging the girl, who was looking down and blushing. Kurenai is not one to lightly praise another's logic, the old man observed, making Kurenai grimace as the girl's blush deepened. The ability to make sound judgments on the spur of the moment is not one to take lightly. Arigato, Hokage-sama, the girl said in a quiet voice. As Kurenai described the battle, which had been as brutal as it was abrupt, the Hokage's tension was only visible in a slight tightening of the weathered skin around his eyes. One of the hardest parts of this job, at least for him, was hearing about the battles of his shinobi after the fact, too late for him to do anything about it. The blood was already drawn, the lives ended. The only thing he could do now was try to draw as many lessons as possible from the now concluded missions. He winced internally when he learned of Shino's burns, but the bandages on his arm were compact, and he did not seem to favor it. He grew alarmed for other reasons when he heard how Hinata was stunned by a lucky hunk of ice. With only Kurenai and Naruto facing 3 opponents. At this point, Kurenai continued, I heard Naruto shout as I fought Lisuke. He successfully drew on the Kyuubi's chakra and used it to shield him from the flames so he was able to close with his opponent and. She stopped as the Hokage's hand slammed down upon the desk. He stared at his jonin, wondering what had possessed her to break the law concerning, and then he noticed that her genin were all staring at him. And while they might have been startled by his outburst, they didn't seem to have reacted to her casual mention of the 9-tailed fox. They already know, Naruto said quietly, his voice sounding far too old for the energetic prankster he knew. Shino figured it out on his own, and Hinata mostly guessed it. But I confirmed it, so no one broke your law. And we did not run screaming into the night, Shino murmured. Hinata frowned, and Sarutobi noticed her hand twitch, like she wanted to reach out to her teammate, but the motion ended almost as soon as it began, and he doubted anyone else even noticed. Naruto. The Hokage began, then stopped to consider his words. It's good to know that they accept you. Perhaps I was being too cautious when I made that law, but I decided to err on the side of caution regarding your future. Naruto looked up and locked eyes with the 3rd Hokage. I understand, was all he said, but it still shook the old man to his core. The boy's eyes were an odd mixture of emotions, anger, sadness, and loneliness so poignant it shriveled his soul. But overriding all the rest was another emotion, forgiveness. Maybe there were better ways the whole situation could have been handled, but Naruto acknowledged that he'd tried his best. It was both a liberating and a humbling experience. He wondered what else the boy had gone through during the mission. Kurenai continued her narrative. He was a little shocked and saddened that Naruto had been put in the position of having to kill 2 of the kidnappers. But all that was forgotten when he heard the words, and I learned that his psychological preparation at the academy had been sabotaged. However, we were able to discuss what he should have learned, and sabotaged? He asked sharply. Yes, Hokage, she replied. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were not. Naruto looked somewhat uncomfortable, but his teammates were staring at their Hokage, almost daring him to speak. Give me a written summary of his actions, he said in a hard voice. Once I have reviewed it, I will have him brought to Ibiki. Thank you, Hokage-sama, Kurenai said. Naruto and Hinata looked mystified, but the Abarame boy merely nodded approvingly. Sarutobi had little doubt that Abarame Shivi had acquainted his son with the names of Konoha's important shinobi. The chief interrogation specialist would definitely be on his list, the old man mused as Kurenai resumed her report. When she was done, the Hokage gave each of them a labeled envelope. Here is your pay for an extended C-class mission, he said. He then took out 3 more envelopes with official Konoha seals on them. These are for the 3 missing nins that were eliminated, he continued. There were substantial bounties placed on their heads by their home villages, as well as other people they'd committed crimes against. He gave one of the envelopes to Kurenai, and tried to hand the other 2 to Naruto, but the blonde boy shook his head. Naruto, Kurenai said gently. You've saved some people a lot of trouble by your actions. It's all right to accept this reward. For many of their victims, offering a bounty is the only way they can strike back at someone who had hurt them or their family. That's not what I mean, sensei, Naruto corrected her, his voice grave. I understand the rewards, but these 2 shouldn't be for me alone. We fought as a team. I mean, I wouldn't even have seen them if Hinata hadn't spotted them through their genjutsu, right? Ano, Naruto, it's all right, the girl said hesitantly. But the boy just shook his head stubbornly. By the rules, Naruto struck the killing blows, Kurenai observed. But that means the money is his to do with as he will. If he wishes to share with his teammates, then so be it. I can get all 3 of these vouchers cashed and we can split the rewards. Ah, sensei, Naruto said quickly, I didn't mean you had to dash. Kurenai cut him off with a gesture. I just happen to agree with you, Naruto. And am I not a member of the team as well? She turned back toward the Hokage. You will have a written report of my observations by tomorrow morning, she promised in a tight voice. The third Hokage of Konohagakure dismissed Team 8 with a bemused smile on his face. He really should have talked Kurenai into taking a genin team long before now. He hadn't seen a team that seemed so in tune with each other since. It was hard, dreadfully hard, not to let other faces overshadow the young ones before him. His own genin, that grew up to become the Sannin, the Yondaime's first and last genin team, the Naraakimika Yamanaka trios that seemed to crop up in each generation. They were all unique, really. The human mind just tries to find patterns to make sense of life, even when there are none to be found. But it didn't require a historical perspective to realize that Kurenai's genin had grown together as a team, and had done so to a greater extent than many experienced shinobi even realized was possible. Hatake Kakashi might understand, when he wasn't too distracted by the ghosts of his past. And while Kurenai had done an excellent job assembling her team, much like a skilled mason might build a brick wall capable of withstanding anything, the Hokage also realized something else. While Kurenai was the mason, Naruto was the mortar that held them all together. Their acceptance had given him something he'd always craved without even being able to understand why. But at the same time his awkward and often foolish demeanor masked a drive and a wisdom, of a sort that the Sandaime only caught rare glimpses of during their infrequent talks. For someone with few real friends, Naruto was amazingly open and accepting. As he'd anticipated, once someone showed the boy some simple kindness, they discovered they'd also made a friend for life, one of surprising loyalty and determination. The third Hokage sighed and rubbed at his eyes. He got up from his chair and paced around his office, wincing at the pops and crackles as his old bones realigned themselves after sitting too long. He paused near the window and looked out across his beloved Konoha, toward the Hokage monument. His eyes lingered on the stone visage of his successor, and, sadly enough, predecessor as well. You did better than you knew, the old man whispered before returning to his paperwork. Oddly enough, Kurenai did not immediately dismiss them once they left the Hokage's office. Naruto frowned a little when she said they had one more task to perform as a team, but that ended the moment she said it was a tradition she'd learned from her old sensei. It didn't take a genius to realize that Kurenai-sensei never talked about her original team, except in the most general of terms. Having been around shinobi much of his life, Naruto noticed how many of them would mention their old teachers or teammates. According to Shikamaru's complaints, his father did little else when they talked, much to the lazy boy's annoyance. However troublesome such habits might be for others, it only made the exceptions to the rule that much more noticeable. Naruto was curious as to why Kurenai never talked of them, but he hesitated to ask. Kurenai was a very private person in some ways, despite her forthright nature, and he suspected that her reasons for not speaking of them were said ones. It wasn't that Naruto ever forgot that they were all shinobi, trained assassins who could be assigned any mission, no matter how dangerous, for the good of their village. But after a while the dangers just seemed so normal, that it was hard to keep them in the forefront of his mind. And perhaps that was for the best, because every time he even considered the possibility of losing his teammates on a mission, his mind sheared away from the enormity of that potential loss. Not for the first time, he realized that he literally would rather die than suffer the loss of one of the few people that cared for him. Kurenai-sensei said that she never expected Naruto to intercept every attack aimed at Shino or Hinata, but that was exactly what he wanted to do. He'd do whatever it took to keep his friends safe. Anything at all. Naruto felt the hairs on the back of his neck begin to rise and realized with a start that the unnatural chakra he'd felt during the battle was returning. Remembering Kurenai's words, he took a deep breath and made an effort to calm himself. He clenched and unclenched his hands, trying to ignore how sharp his fingernails were becoming, and hoping that his canines didn't look as large as they suddenly felt. He looked up at his teammates, to remind himself that they were all right. Shino was walking silently beside Kurenai, hunched inside of his spare trench coat. Hinata was walking beside Naruto, seemingly lost in thought. Though she walked with her eyes downcast, Naruto noticed that she'd fully adapted to her weights, and walked as gracefully as ever with their mass added to her arms and legs. Somehow the sight of her seemed to calm him, quelling the rising tide of anxiety about the future that wanted to overwhelm him. He could feel his body returning to what, for him, counted as normal. Almost as if she were sensing his thoughts, Hinata glanced toward Naruto, only to jump a little when she locked gazes with him. Her face turned red and she clasped her hands together. "Ano?" she asked hesitantly. "Looks like you're ready to increase your weights again, Hinata-chan," Naruto said brightly, relieved that the anxious pressure building inside of him was draining away. "Oh," Hinata said, looking crestfallen. Sorry," she stammered, "I should have noticed sooner, and dash." Naruto frowned and her words cut off suddenly and she looked away. Why was she always apologizing for things that were not her fault? You know, Hinata, we've been out in the woods for several weeks. It's not like you could buy extra weights from a squirrel." The kunoichi didn't respond to his lame attempt at humor, and just looked down at her feet as they walked. Naruto sighed. He didn't know why his words always came out weird when he talked to Hinata, but he was getting tired of it. "Look," he said. "I was just trying to say that you've fully adapted to wearing the weights, probably because you work really hard and probably slept with the damn things on. I need to get more weight added to mine as well. I'm sorry if it came out wrong, but I was trying to say nice work. And I'm really glad you're on my team, too. I can't picture Ino or Sakura working as hard as you have." There, he thought with some satisfaction, no way can she take that wrong. He smiled at his teammate. Hinata was left several paces behind as her legs momentarily froze in place. Her face turned bright red and Naruto wouldn't have been surprised if her hair started to smoke and frizz up. He blinked, then ran back and waved his hand in front of Hinata's eyes, startling her out of her daze. She ducked her head down with a small smile and they turned to follow their teammates. Only to discover that Kurenai and Shino had turned around as well, and were staring at them. Naruto shrugged and scratched the back of his head with a sheepish grin. At least he'd made himself understood properly. It was about time. Hinata managed to get her face back under control by the time Kurenai-sensei led them to their destination. She found it difficult to concentrate after Naruto's blunt, but honest words. She realized he was mirroring her words to him when she reassured him that she still wanted him to stay on Team 8, Kyuubi and all, but it still shocked her when he said that he'd rather have her on his team than Ino or Sakura. Especially when she considered all the times he'd tried to ask Sakura out when they were in the academy. Naruto was glad she was his teammate. Her. The Hyuga reject, who failed everything she ever tried to do, except maybe at being Naruto's friend. She knew she'd helped him, at least a little, that day by the stream, even if she had gone about it all wrong. She supposed she should be grateful to the fates. If she were only going to be allowed to do one thing right, then this would be the one that she would pick. Hinata's bemused thoughts cut off in surprise when Kurenai led them to Moritakes for their last task of the day. The Jonin's face was even more somber than usual as she explained that her Jonin-sensei always brought his team here after a long mission away from Konoha to discuss the mission, plan what they would work on next, and generally celebrate their success. Hinata knew from the way their sensei always spoke of them in the past tense that Kurenai-sensei's team was no more. She was nowhere near as skilled at reading people as a proper Hyuga should be, but she didn't have to be to know that something dreadful must have happened to them. Shino and Naruto seemed to pick up on this as well, because they were silent as Kurenai led them inside, greeted the owner with a nod, and settled them at a table in a darkened corner. Despite their stated purpose of celebration in coming there, they were all silent as they waited for their orders to arrive. Kurenai seemed extremely distracted by something, and frowned off into the distance. Hinata noticed Naruto fidgeting nervously. If she wasn't used to the frequent formal dinners at the Hyuga compound, she'd probably do the same. Finally, Naruto could no longer contain himself and spoke up. "Sensei," he asked, "what was your Jonin-sensei like?" Kurenai froze with her sake halfway to her lips and Hinata held her breath. While she was equally curious, she couldn't believe Naruto had just asked their sensei like that. "Why do you want to know?" Kurenai asked in a far too quiet voice. Hinata had only seen Kurenai become really angry once, after speaking to her father. She'd come out of the conversation possessed by a cold fury that was frankly terrifying. She didn't understand what her father had said to provoke such a reaction, but she knew she never wanted to see such rage in her sensei again. Naruto's voice took on an unusually thoughtful tone as he stared into the distance. For an instant, Hinata pictured his unusually somber expression under the Hokage's traditional hat and felt a shudder of premonition. Was she watching fates change before her eyes? "He was your sensei," was all Naruto said after a moment. To their surprise, Shino spoke up as well. "If he's had anywhere near as large an effect on you, as you have had on your students, then a desire to know more about him is only logical." "Yeah," Naruto added, nodding, "that almost makes him our sensei as well, doesn't it?" "I would be honored to hear of him as well," Hinata heard herself adding. She was horrified at the thought of prying into potentially painful memories, but Naruto and Shino's reasons had moved her. And she had to back up her teammates as well. Kurenai-sensei was quiet for a moment as the waitress brought out their orders. After she left though, the Jonin began to talk. Kobaru-sensei was not the sort of person you would picture as a shinobi. He was even stockier than Sarutobi Asuma, who works with your classmates on Team 10, and Kobaru was nearly a head taller. As a teammate once said, he looked like a boulder that had grown legs and gone for a walk. With his size and strength, he was formidable with taijutsu, but he always said, only a fool hunts with one arrow in his quiver, so he made a point of learning. Hinata sat, utterly still, as her sensei's voice painted a vivid picture of the man who'd played a major role in making her the kunoichi that sat before them. Their food sat, cooling, and forgotten. It was after dark before they left Moritake's. It was odd for Naruto to feel like he'd come to know someone he'd never met, but it was a good sort of odd. He could see where Kurenai-sensei had learned a lot from the man, but added her own spin to his lessons before she passed them on. He wondered what he would teach his genins when he was a jonin. Hopefully by that time everyone would have forgotten about sexy no jutsu. If they didn't, he was going to have a little talk with Kano Amaru. Naruto shook his head at that thought. When Kurenai dismissed them, the pensive jonin gave them the next day off to rest and replace any damaged or worn gear. It was well past visiting hours at the hospital, but he'd make time to visit Iruka-sensei tomorrow. Naruto grimaced at the thought of all the laundry he needed to do before he went to sleep. The sooner he resumed working with Guy and Lee, the less pain would be involved in catching up. Tomorrow morning he would seek them out again. Maybe Guy would have some heavier weights he could borrow. Naruto's musings were interrupted as Shino and his sensei made their goodbyes. He turned toward Hinata, but the slump of her shoulders suggested that she was less than enthusiastic about going home. Naruto frowned as he wondered how accurate his conclusions about her family were. If he wasn't delusional, that might explain why she lingered outside the restaurant instead of immediately going home. Hinata?" he asked. Hinata jumped and looked up from the fingers she was absently pressing together. "Why yes, Naruto. I'm going to do some extra training tomorrow with Guy-sensei and Lee, if they aren't out on a mission. Would you like to come as well?" he asked. "No," she said hesitantly as her cheeks reddened slightly, "wouldn't that be rude? To come uninvited?" "Nah," Naruto said. "I'll just tell Guy that you were so impressed with my progress that you wanted to see his training methods. He'll go crazy, so just nod politely every time he says something about that power of youth thing." He shook his head. "And don't look at their teeth when they smile or you'll be rubbing the spots out of your eyes for a while." Hinata's eyes widened at Naruto's open duplicity. I mean, I can't dash." Naruto nodded quickly, bouncing on the balls of his feet. "Sure you can. He's actually nice, in his own weird way. And Lee really wants to beat your cousin, who is his eternal rival, and practicing with another Jyuken user can only help him, right?" Hinata nodded slowly. "Great," Naruto said with a smile. "But you better get some sleep. Those two keep some really early hours. Can you meet me in front of Ichiraku's at 5:30? Hinata smiled a little this time, and Naruto felt an odd sense of accomplishment. "Hi," she said, agreeing. "See you in the morning, Hinata-chan." He called out as he raced toward his apartment. He needed to get his laundry going, take as hot a shower as he could stand, and then reacquaint himself with his bed. Hinata stared after the boy as he left, wondering what she'd just gotten herself into. If Naruto actually wanted her there, she supposed she could deal with the awkwardness. If Guy and Lee didn't want her around, she doubted they'd be shy about letting her know. No one else was. She tried not to dwell on where she was going as her feet carried her home. The branch family member on duty acknowledged her return with the barest of nods as she entered the compound. Hinata was relieved she was able to slip into her father's house without encountering anyone. Once in her room, with the door shut, she let out a shuddering breath and tried to relax. She unpacked her bag, setting out the items that desperately needed cleaning. The uniform she was wearing was definitely in that category as well, so she changed into a bathing robe and, after setting out her laundry, crept into the bathroom for a long soak. The hot water soothed her muscles, but just being in this house was increasing her mental tension. She wasn't wanted here. She didn't belong here. She was a failure in a clan that didn't tolerate failures. The realization she'd come to on the way back to Konoha burned ever brighter in her mind. She didn't want to be here. Naruto's fingers were still tingling from his shinobi alarm clock when he arrived in front of Ichiraku's. Hinata had evidently arrived a little early, and was watching the old man fuss over his stove as he prepared for another busy day. He waved goodbye, promising they'd be back for breakfast, and led Hinata to Guy and Lee's favorite training ground. "Ah, Naruto," Guy called out as they entered the clearing. "I heard your team had returned to Konoha, flush with victory and the fire of youth. Are you ready for more steps on the path to become a genius of hard work?" Yeah," Naruto said, rubbing at the back of his neck while Hinata stared at the odd duo. "And I brought someone who works even harder than I do." "Yosh!" Lee cried out. "My favorite sparring partner and rival of hard work has returned to Konoha." Naruto wasn't sure if it was possible, but his eyebrows seemed even thicker than he'd remembered. "Lee. You are so passionate. You are truly my student." Tears were streaming from the Jonin's eyes, making them sparkle unnaturally in the dim morning light. "Guy-sensei." "Lee. Guy-sensei." "Lee." Naruto said, interrupting the happy duo. He could have sworn that he heard music off in the distance. "This is Hyuga Hinata," he said, nudging the dubious-looking girl forward. "Ah," Guy said, distracted from their cacophonous duet. "You must be the cousin of my student Neji." "Hi," Hinata said, bowing quickly. Naruto thought she looked like she wanted to bolt out of the clearing and hide. "She's heard me brag about your incredible training techniques," Naruto said quickly. "And she wanted to see for herself. I think they are probably superior to the Hyuga methods, but only Hinata can judge that for certain." Hinata spun toward Naruto, her mouth hanging open in shock. The blonde shinobi had been a little worried about laying it on too thickly with the green-clad Jonin. He shouldn't have wasted the energy. "Yosh! The fire of youth extends even into the cold Hyuga clan," Guy exclaimed happily. "Neji is a genius, but he lacks Lee's fire and enthusiasm. I will be more than happy to fan the fires of her determination to excel." Hinata gaped at the Jonin as he and Lee broke into another chorus. She turned to Naruto, her expression puzzled. "That means you are more than welcome to train with us, Hinata-chan," Naruto translated with a grin and a roll of his eyes. As they set to work, Naruto braced himself for an unpleasant task, getting caught up to Lee again. The spandex-clad genin was even faster than he remembered, and while Naruto wore his weights on the border patrol mission, he couldn't afford to train himself to exhaustion in hostile territory. At first, all Naruto could see were green blurs as he tried to block a typhoon of kicks and punches. Even when he did successfully block, Naruto had to lock his stance to avoid being blown off his feet. He could feel his sandals skidding backward on the grass. He grew frustrated enough to anchor his feet to the ground with chakra, only to have Lee go aerial on him, and send him flying with a spinning jump kick that went over his block. Naruto tumbled when he hit the ground, finally skidding on his shoulders and back as he tried to get his eyes to focus. Then he pulled his knees up to his chest and did a kip-up. He was a little dizzy, but his feet were steady. "I see you got soft while I was away," Naruto said cockily, even as his vision swam slightly. "That should have knocked me out." "Yosh!" Lee shouted and came at him again. As Naruto's blood got moving, his aches faded away in the excitement of combat. Lee scored 3 more solid hits, but Naruto sprang to his feet even faster and returned to the battle. Finally, he successfully ducked away from one of Lee's palm heel strikes, and managed to grab the boy's elbow before he could pull back. Lee chopped at Naruto's elbow, but the blonde's other hand grabbed that wrist before it could connect. Naruto forced his hands apart, yanking Lee temporarily off balance and right into the knee. Naruto slammed into his stomach, even as his forehead cracked into Lee's jaw. Lee staggered back, gasping for breath and rubbing at his jaw. "It's great to have you back, Naruto-san," he exclaimed happily. He turned to Guy. "Sensei, do you think I can attempt that move again?" Guy frowned thoughtfully, his eyes wandering over Naruto, and then Hinata. "With me here to supervise, I think it will be safe." Naruto, Hinata, Lee has been working hard to perfect a special finishing move. He would like to work with Naruto for his first attempt, but it is important that no one mention this move with others. It is to be Lee's secret weapon. His voice rose at the end, and he gave one of those nice guy poses that made his teeth shine with unnatural brightness. "All right," Naruto said dubiously. Then he shook his head. Guy wouldn't let him be injured, even if this was a finishing move. Kurenai-sensei would kill him. For all his quirks, Might Guy didn't appear to be suicidal. All the same, Naruto couldn't help but gulp as he dropped into a defensive stance. Lee had his hands clasped together and gasped, "First gate, open." Then he disappeared in a blur of motion. Naruto's eyes had just begun to track downward when Lee's foot drove upward into his stomach, launching him into the air. He heard Lee shout, "Kagebuyo," and suddenly he could see his sparring partner out of the corner of his eye, leaping into the air behind him, in a parallel arc. Naruto felt something wrapping around his arms. He looked down as he struggled to free himself. It looked like Lee's arm bandages. Then the boy's arms wrapped around his upper arms in a grip of iron. "Omote range!" Lee shouted as they began to spin rapidly. As he struggled to break free, a corner of his mind observed that he was very lucky to have not eaten breakfast yet. It was hard to tell with all the spinning, but Naruto thought they had passed the top of their shared trajectory and were now shooting toward the ground at high speed. As he frantically tried to break free, he realized the purpose of this strange attack. With the way Lee gripped him, his head would strike the ground first, with their combined momentum behind it. Truly a deadly technique. Naruto's appreciation of the technique was, of course, marred by the fact that he was about to become its first victim. He was seriously considering calling on the red chakra when the two of them jarred to a halt. "That's enough!" Guy shouted as he caught the two of them. With Lee's grip relaxed, Naruto was able to burst out of the bandages. He tried to turn around and immediately fell to the ground, too dizzy to walk. "Did I do it right?" Lee asked in a worried tone as leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "If you didn't, I don't ever want to see the right version," Naruto groaned as he tried to swallow. Empty or not, his stomach was feeling rather delicate at the moment. That launching kick certainly hadn't helped either. He saw Hinata, out of the corner of his eye, watching anxiously. He gave her a small wave and she looked down with a sigh of relief. "Yes, Lee," Guy said, pausing dramatically. "You have mastered the Omote range," he shouted. Such a flowery name for a move that plants your opponent like a turnip, Naruto groused as he tried to climb to his feet, sternly addressing his rebellious inner ear. How Lee was able to stand up at all was completely beyond him. "Yes, Naruto," Guy said as he helped the genin stand up. "It's a very dangerous move, and only to be used in extreme circumstances. Is that understood, Lee?" Lee nodded, and then pulled out a small notepad and pencil and began writing. "Yes, Sensei. Now that I know I can do it, I will only use it in extreme circumstances. When I tell your teammates of your success in the first phase of your initial training, they will be so proud," Guy exclaimed. "Yosh, Guy-sensei." Lee agreed. "Lee. Guy-sensei." At this point Naruto's stomach had enough and he vomited on Guy's sandals. "Sorry," he murmured as he stumbled backwards, still feeling like the world was spinning around him. "Ah, the after effects were more severe than I anticipated," Guy exclaimed, raising one besmeared foot and frowning at it. "Make a note of that, Lee." "Yes, Sensei." Lee replied with a serious expression, notepad in hand. Paradoxically, Naruto felt better after puking, which didn't make much sense to him. A light touch on his shoulder made him turn his head. Hinata offered him a clean cloth and a cup of tea from her thermos. Naruto accepted both gratefully, realizing that she seemed to always be prepared for any emergency with her bag, something he would do well to emulate. While Naruto-san recovers, would you do us the honor, Hyuga-sama? Guy asked politely. Hinata's face immediately reddened, but after an encouraging smile from Naruto, she nodded. Watching Hinata spar with Lee was interesting, and soon Naruto's spasming stomach was forgotten. Lee was still pretty fast, but doing the Omote wrench seemed to have taken a lot out of him. Nevertheless, after the first few exchanges with the Hyuga girl, he started to go all out again. Naruto noticed Hinata doing many of the things she used against him when they sparred. He supposed his personal taijutsu style had been influenced by Guy and Lee's Goken, but it was still illuminating to see his teammate flow around Lee's attack and make delicate-seeming Jaiuken strikes that left the boy moving slower and slower. Finally, she got through his guard and scored a glancing blow to his left shoulder that made the whole arm freeze up. Lee jumped back with a frown, rubbing at the joint. Ah! Just like with Neji, he groaned. Lee! Do not let yourself become discouraged. Guy said in a serious voice. Naruto-san, you regularly spar with Hinata, do you not? Hi. Naruto agreed with a nod, ignoring the way Hinata's fingers were pushing together again. How do you defend against her Jaiuken strikes? He asked. Well, Naruto said slowly, trying to ignore the way Lee had his notepad out again, hanging on his every word. I usually can't block them directly without getting zapped, and slowing down until she has me at her mercy. He said the last bit with a straight face, but grinned at her blush. I have to dodge more and block less. In fact, unless I am close enough to block her upper arms, I don't block at all. Otherwise, she pushes chakra into my arm muscles or one of my tenketsu points and that hurts. He shrugged. I have to come in at odd angles a lot more. And I have to be ready to reopen any tenketsu that get closed. Reopen? Guy asked sharply. Naruto nodded. Yes, if I push a hunk of chakra towards that point on my body, it usually pops back open. He shrugged. Hurts like hell, though, like that pins and needles feeling, only about 100 times worse. I see. Guy said dubiously. Lee's eyes had gone wide however. Sensei. Can I learn to do this? Naruto shrugged. Hinata helped me figure out how, he said. Now the Jonin and both Genin were staring at the Hyuga girl, causing her cheeks to glow a bright red. Ano, she said hesitantly, Naruto did most of it out himself. I just told him when it seemed to be working. Still, Lee's enthusiasm would not be deterred. After 15 minutes of effort though, Lee's shoulder was just barely able to flex. According to Hinata, his chakra couldn't push quite hard enough to reopen the tenketsu point she had closed. Lee looked downcast as he told them that the reason he concentrated so much on taijutsu was because his chakra coils were severely underdeveloped. Hinata looked mortified that her technique had forced the proud young genin to admit to his weakness, and Naruto didn't miss the way her hands bunched into fists holding the hem of her jacket. Hey, he said quickly, causing Lee to look up, at least you didn't fail the genin exam 3 times like I did. He smiled ruefully. If Mizuki hadn't been a traitor, I might still be at the academy. Of course, after saying something like that, he had to explain the whole mess that ended with him wearing Iruka-sensei's hitai. Naruto hadn't had much experience telling stories before, but with this audience it was easy. Both Hinata and Lee seemed to hang on his words, and even Guy-sensei listened quietly, nodding thoughtfully. It wasn't until halfway through the tale that he hesitated, wondering how he should handle Mizuki taunting him about the Kyuubi. Guy, of course, already knew, as did Hinata. Only Lee was ignorant, but Naruto knew Lee would follow Guy's lead. He'd been right to trust Hinata and Shino, maybe telling Lee would turn out as well. So Mizuki started taunting me about the village's secret law, which made Iruka-sensei really mad. He continued, though, telling me about how when the nine-tailed fox attacked Konoha, the Yondaime wasn't really able to kill him, no one could. Instead, the Hokage sealed the demon up inside a newborn baby, namely me. Well, suddenly things started making a lot more sense, like how all the adults hated me, because I was holding the demon that killed their loved ones, including Iruka-sensei's parents. I was so shocked I could barely move when Mizuki hurled this huge Fuma shuriken at me. Next thing I knew, I was on my back, and Iruka was crouched over me, with that big shuriken stuck out of his back. Naruto paused to catch his breath and check his audience. Lee's unnaturally round eyes were practically bulging from the sockets, and Hinata looked to be on the verge of tears. Guy nodded grimly, though his eyes were bright as well. Iruka told me that he didn't blame me at all, and that he could tell I wasn't a demon. He said we were both alike, in that we grew up very lonely. Naruto's voice trailed off, as he hadn't originally intended to go into that part. Anyway, he continued after a deep breath. Mizuki came after us again, only this time I was more mad than anything else. So I tried the new technique I'd learned from the Forbidden Scroll, Kagebunshin no Jutsu. He grinned. Iruka looked like he was going to have a heart attack, but Mizuki just started screaming as all my clones jumped on him and beat him down. Then Iruka-sensei stood up and told me to close my eyes. When I opened them, he'd tied his Hitaiite onto my head and told me that I'd passed. Yosh! Lee roared, making Naruto and Hinata both jump. Naruto-san, he continued in a slightly quieter voice, you are such an inspiration. Surely you are an incarnation of the power of youth. Naruto wasn't so sure about that, since it sounded a little painful. But at least Lee wasn't making his ears ring anymore, so that was something. Lee is correct, Naruto, Guy added in a more reflective tone as he nodded at the blonde genin. That was no doubt a very difficult tale to share. Thank you for using it to inspire Lee. If Naruto can overcome such obstacles, Lee declared, his eyes seeming to catch fire, then a lack of chakra is nothing. I will find a way to defeat Neji, even without chakra. You ever catch him with that turnip planting move, you'll kick his ass, Naruto agreed, his stomach rolling slightly at the memory. Lee has indeed worked very hard to perfect that move, Guy agreed. Tonight, we will celebrate his success. He declared. You two are both invited, as well. Hinata's eyes widened, but Naruto answered for both of them. We'll be there, he said. Good, good, Guy said punching the palm of his hand. Hinata-san, you are welcome to join us any morning you wish. Any assistance you can give Lee, will be most welcome. However, I would ask that you not mention any of this to your cousin, Neji. He is highly skilled, but I think it would be good for his training if he were to receive some youthful surprises when he spars. It will demonstrate how he should never underestimate his opponents. Is this acceptable to you? He asked politely. Hinata nodded, eyes wide. At this point, Naruto and Lee were both recovered, but Guy had Naruto and Hinata spar while he and Lee took copious notes. Hinata seemed a little self-conscious at first, but they soon settled into a quick rhythm of attack and counter-attack. Naruto slipped first, and felt a spike of chakra blast through his elbow, locking the joint as capillaries ruptured and the muscles cramped painfully. But he was able to grab Hinata's forearm with his good hand before she could pull back. Naruto rolled backward, planting his feet in Hinata's stomach like he'd done before and launching her into the air. His working hand flashed toward his kunao pouch and he sent a trio of blunted shuriken toward his teammate. Hinata's kunao appeared in her hand like magic and she deflected the two shuriken that would have hit her. She tucked her legs up to speed her rotation so she would land feet down. But no sooner did her feet touch the earth than Naruto was right on top of her, a flash of yellow on his palm as his hand brushed the sleeve of her jacket. Raiden, shocking Guhaji. He said as the jutsu discharged. Hinata flinched violently at the shock, but Naruto had summoned just enough electricity for her to feel it, but not enough to hurt. Naruto stepped back, proud of scoring a hit, as well as the proof of his hard-earned chakra control. Then he saw Hinata's head and the grin froze on his face. The electrical discharge left Hinata's hair standing on end, forming an indigo cloud around her head. It was pretty funny, but Naruto refused to laugh at her expense as he massaged his bruised elbow. As the kunoichi settled back into a ready stance, Naruto hesitated. He knew Hinata was easily embarrassed, and the condition of her hair would probably mortify her, as funny as it might be. He was tempted to just not say anything, but Guy and Lee were watching. Finally, it came down to the fact that she was his teammate. If he let it go without saying anything, he was turning his back on that. Hey Hinata. He asked. Hinata frowned. But she didn't make a connection between her hair and the vague gestures Naruto was making over the top of his own head. Finally, he just gave up and stepped forward, rapidly patting down her static raised hair. Unfortunately, individual strands wanted to cling to his fingers, so he had to stroke the dark blue hair a couple of times before it would lie flat. He'd been hoping to save the kunoichi some embarrassment, but her face was bright red when he stepped back. Your hair, it was sticking up from the jutsu," he explained. "Oh," was all Hinata said. Then she dropped into a Jyuken stance and came at him again. By the time they left Guy and Lee, Hinata was as tired and hungry as her teammate professed to be. Even her stomach growled once as they walked back toward town, making Naruto crack up as she looked horrified. "Nah, Hinata," he reassured her, "you're hungry because you've been working hard all morning. No one's going to think you're rude because you want to improve." Hinata tried to draw encouragement from Naruto's words, but she could still feel scourged by her father's contempt for crude behavior. Her face was downcast as she tried to banish his hateful words. "Ano," she asked after a moment, "where are we going?" "This is the other half of my morning routine," he explained. "Guy and Lee train too early for me to eat breakfast first, and they work me hard, so I always have a healthy appetite, and here we are." He gestured grandly and Hinata realized that they were standing in front of Ichiraku's. "I get something to eat before I meet with teammate. Go to make sure I don't pass out when we're looking for that dem cat again," Naruto said enthusiastically. He quickly looked left and right and then leaned forward. "It's not quite as good as yours, of course," he whispered confidentially, "but nice and quick." Hinata found herself blushing again. It was nice how Naruto, and even Shino, always complimented her on cooking, especially when she wasn't that good. She'd prepared a few meals for her family on special occasions and none of them had remarked on their quality. Still, it was nice that her teammates tried so hard to make her feel better, so she obliged him by smiling a little. A couple of villagers got up from the counter at that moment, and Naruto grabbed her hand and hauled her forward before someone else claimed the vacated stools. Hinata thought her knees were going to collapse when his fingers closed around hers, but she managed not to squeak. She knew her teammate was just concerned about filling his stomach, not that she wasn't hungry as well, but it was pleasant, for a moment, to pretend that he was holding her hand for other reasons. Futile, but pleasant. "Oi! Old man! You have no idea how much I missed this place," Naruto called out as he plopped down on one of the stools. Hinata was a bit quieter as she sat down as well, a little disappointed when Naruto let go of her hand. "Hello Naruto," the old man called out happily, "it's been far too quiet these last few weeks." "Hey Ayam! Look who's back." The cook's daughter looked up from the vegetables she was chopping. She smiled and waved at Naruto, and to Hinata's surprise the young woman winked at her when Naruto had turned back to her father. "So what's the special today?" Naruto asked eagerly. "Himeno with rice, miso soup, and pickled daikon," the old man replied with a smile. "That sounds perfect," Naruto said as he pulled out his bulging Gamachan wallet. Before they went to Moritake's-sensei had stopped at the bank and cashed in all 3 bingo book vouchers, splitting the money between the 4 of them. Hinata wanted to refuse at first, but after distracting Naruto for a moment, Kurenai-sensei had whispered to her that sharing the reward was one way for Naruto to lessen his anguish at being forced to take 2 lives. She didn't think he'd be able to enjoy any of the reward unless it was shared with his friends. That had effectively stifled any of Hinata's objections. She'd do anything to make him feel better. That said, she still didn't want him spending his money on her now. "Ano, Naruto," she said quickly, "I can pay for my own," she objected. "That's okay," he said with a grin. "You can pay for tomorrow's." Hinata opened her mouth and then closed it again. The strange Jonin and his student had invited her to train with them any time she wanted, but she was sure he was just being polite. Or perhaps he was just being courteous to Naruto, who they both seemed to respect. She was happy to see others who appreciated her friend's positive qualities, but she didn't want to presume upon that either. On the other hand, they did seem interested in studying her Jyuken techniques. Lee's commitment to defeating her cousin was laudable, and reminded her of Naruto's unflagging determination. While she was nowhere near Neji's level, perhaps she could help in some small way. But did that make her disloyal to her family? Guy said it would be good for Neji to be surprised occasionally, as it would make him less likely to underestimate a real opponent. At first she'd been a little dismayed to see how easily Naruto revealed his secret to Lee, in comparison to the difficulties he had telling her. In truth, he hadn't told her so much as give a few hints and then confirm her guesses. It hurt to think that he could be so much more open with Lee. But then she noticed how he was smiling at her when he paused for breath in the middle, like they were sharing some secret joke. It made her very warm inside, this inclusive feeling. It was then that she realized that it was her and Shino's acceptance of him that made it easier to him to tell Lee. That alone had made the whole morning worthwhile. Lost in thought, Hinata was slow to notice as Naruto's face fell, but his words captured her attention. "Don't worry about it, Hinata," he said in a falsely cheery voice that she was only lately able to detect. "I know I keep some ridiculously long hours with all this training, so." Hinata shook her head. "I would be honored to train with the three of you, but will I not be more of a bother?" Whether she attended or not, she wasn't about to let Naruto think it had anything to do with him. She almost cringed when she realized he was hiding his true feelings again. That would not do at all. Naruto shook his head firmly. "Did you see all those notes Lee took?" When they were assigned to Guy, he and Neji were put on the same team because Neji had the highest scores in the academy, while Lee barely passed. "He doesn't talk about it, but I think your cousin said some things that first day that really ticked Lee off. He's been dying to find some way of defeating his eternal rival, and Guy wants all his hard work to pay off in the end." Hinata's eyes went wide at that explanation. Naruto didn't show it often, but she was occasionally surprised by how much he picked up on. Of course, training with someone 3 or 4 hours every day would doubtlessly give you a lot of insight into their character, but still. "I see," was all she could say to that. "I don't think it would be disloyal to my family to assist in training my cousin's teammate." The grin that split Naruto's face was genuine this time, much to Hinata's relief. The fake one made her feel slightly ill, wondering how long he had worn it to make the disguise so seamless. "You're the greatest, Hinata-chan." He beamed. Hinata ducked her head down instinctively, even as her cheeks reddened again. Fortunately, her embarrassing moment was cut short as the kindly older man set a pair of plates down before them. "Itadakimasu," they both said, Naruto in a far louder voice, and then they fell on their food like a pair of starving wolves. Hinata, as a Hyuga, of course maintained perfect table manners at all times, but her chopsticks moved rather quickly nonetheless. Abarame Shino awoke and performed his morning ablutions with the same precision he always followed when at home. He moved through the house like a soundless wraith, and was soon tending a rather promising-looking colony of winged kikai bugs. Their ability to fly at an extremely high rate of speed gave them exceptional maneuverability, but they performed somewhat erratically under stress. It was thought that the enhanced speed with which they moved made that inevitable, but he and his father were testing that hypothesis by crossing them with more phlegmatic ground-born strains. Only 3 of the resulting sub-strains retained their wings, and only this one showed any signs of improved responsiveness or obedience. Despite his concentration, Shino was fully aware of the opening and closing of the door behind him. "Is there something you'd like to discuss?" his father asked in a low voice as he looked over his shoulder at the armature-mounted magnifying glass Shino was using to observe the queen's egg production. "Perhaps," Shino allowed. He'd said barely 3 words since arriving home late the previous night. He was highly annoyed regarding some issues, but that was not sufficient reason for him to behave in an overly emotional manner. Shouting at his parents and the clan elders would be highly counterproductive, even if it would entail a certain, visceral, satisfaction. "I know the secret behind the Hokage's lore regarding Uzumaki Naruto," he finally said. "I see," his father said with a quiet sigh. "I suppose I should see the Hokage about getting you assigned to another team." Shino turned toward his father. "Why would I desire such an irrational action to be taken on my behalf?" he asked in a clipped monotone. Abarame Shivi opened his mouth, but then closed it without speaking. After a moment he began again. "I assumed that your anger was related to the secret being revealed. As this is apparently not the case, I will await your interpretation of the situation." Shino adjusted his sunglasses. "My dissatisfaction with the situation stems from the attitude of the elders toward my teammate, A shinobi who had borne a large burden, practically since birth, with a dignity and aplomb that leaves me embarrassingly humbled, he said in a tight voice. Despite this, the elders of our clan openly disparaged him throughout his childhood. This attitude, promulgated through the elder generation, infected the thinking of myself and others of our cohort, to the extent that their distaste for Uzumaki Naruto was communicated, in full, to practically everyone he came into contact with. I now find myself questioning the judgment, rationality, and fitness to lead of the elders, as well as the rest of their generation. I find myself questioning the Abarame clan's commitment to logic, and whether I still have a place within it. Shivi's eyebrows were completely visible above his sunglasses. Shino's statement was the equivalent, in Abarame terms, of shouting himself hoarse and setting all their houses on fire. I see, he said slowly. I admit I have had little to no contact with the boy. Most of my opinions were likewise formed listening to reports from our representative to the village council. I believe he is known as a chronic prankster, and many have petitioned the Hokage to have him removed from the academy or censured in other ways. Naruto's eccentricities, Shino said, choosing his words with care, are somewhat understandable when viewed in light of his almost total social isolation. It is also a matter of public record that since he began working with Kurenai-sensei and Team 8, Naruto has yet to pull a prank on any of the villagers. Abarame Shivi stared at his son for a long moment. What do you intend to do at this point? He finally asked. I would speak with the Abarame elders regarding Naruto, Shino answered. Loyalty to my teammate and a fellow shinobi of the Leaf demands no less. And if they refuse to ameliorate their attitudes? Shivi asked. I believe one of Uzumaki's sayings comes to mind, Shino replied. We'll burn that bridge when we get to it. That's it for part 7. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.